The 1960s, a decade of social and political unrest, racial movements, and protests that shook the nation. Anti-war sentiment spread throughout the country as the wildly unpopular and contentious Vietnam War polarized the nation. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was born. Integration began, but de facto segregation practices were still common. The volatility of the decade was pronounced by racial tension and discrimination. To the group of Americans who advocated for equality, it became clear, through the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, that if people dared to make their voices heard, they would quickly be silenced. In the midst of prominent racial divisions, two Black Americans stepped up to the podium at the 1968 Olympics and gave a symbol that would last in the nation's collective memory. It was a silent gesture, a symbol of triumph that was broadcasted all across the world, came with the price of opposition and tragedy. The silent gesture of 1968 showed that when politics enter the sports arena, there becomes a triumph of representation and a tragedy of repercussion. 1967. Preparing for the Summer Olympics to take place the following year, International Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage was responsible. Brundage held a long-standing philosophy that politics did not belong in the Olympics, but his past actions had proven to contradict his words.
Avery Brundage was a racist guy, and he called up there and threatened the Black athletes. He called them boy. You really can't imagine me being military man, fighting for my country, and I have someone call me a boy.
Harry Edwards, a young athlete and activist at San Jose State University, founded an organization to respond to Brundage's views, as well as the racial inequalities that existed in America. Consisting of amateur Black athletes, Edwards called the organization the Olympic Project for Human Rights, or the OPHR. He recruited athletes John Carlos and Tommy Smith.
For me to be on a board like this, I thought it very necessary to indicate the need for young Black athletes to stand up for rights, stand up for a belief, stand up for doing something that will help generations later on, and that fighting for equality in these United States.
The leaders of the OPHR organized an African-American boycott of the 1968 Olympic Games. They contacted Brundage with several demands necessary for appeasement. The OPHR demanded the exclusion of apartheid countries like South Africa from the Olympics, as well as the restoration of Muhammad Ali's heavyweight boxing title, which had been revoked a year earlier because of Ali's refusal to be inducted into the U.S. Army. They asked for more diversity within the International Olympic Committee, and finally, the OPHR demanded that Brundage must resign from his post as president of the International Olympic Committee. Despite these plans for action, by early 1968, it had become apparent that many athletes would not sacrifice their opportunity to compete at the Olympics. With the boycott having failed, the members of the OPHR agreed that each athlete would convey the organization's message in their own way. Mexico City, October 16, 1968. 24-year-old Tommy Smith and 23-year-old John Carlos stepped up to the track, representing the United States in the men's 200 meters.
Roberts, it's John Carlos right now. It's Carlos and Smith, and here comes Tommy Smith. Smith has done it with his hands in the air.
Tommy Smith won first, setting a world record. John Carlos placed third, with Australian Peter Norman finishing second. Inspired by the OPHR, the three athletes had decided to demonstrate on the podium. Norman sported an OPHR badge on his jacket, with Smith and Carlos leading the gesture.
He had gloves, I had beads. We both had black socks. He had a black scarf on his neck and I had a black shirt over my USA jersey. We went out there barefoot. Of course, we had a black glove on.
As the national anthem began, Smith and Carlos thrust their black gloved fists in the air in a silent gesture. This was not only a personal triumph for the two medalists, but it was a symbol of support and unity. A triumph for those involved in the civil rights movement in America. The silent gesture was a triumph for the African American men women, and children who were watching over their television sets to see representation on a global level. President Lyndon B. Johnson received letters applauding Smith and Carlos. As stated by private citizen David McNair, these young men made this gesture because they love America, not because they hate her. They were saying to America that though she is the greatest nation in the world, she has not always heard the cries of her black citizens, who have worked so hard and patiently to help make her great. Following the triumph of representation, the International Olympic Committee revoked the athletes' visas, expelling them from the Olympic Village and from Mexico City. Brundage demanded that Smith and Carlos be stripped of their medals for their violation of the Olympic spirit. Many Americans compared Smith and Carlos to patriotic Black American George Foreman, who had proudly waved an American flag after winning a gold medal. Winner of 4 Olympic gold medals in 1936, African-American athlete Jesse Owens also expressed opposition to Smith and Carlos's gesture. He publicly supported the Olympic Committee's decision to expel the athletes.
To me, politics has no part to play on the field of strife of competition. I've never believed it.
Smith and Carlos arrived back to America, where their tragedy continued in their everyday lives.
And they got punished for it for years. Couldn't get a decent job, get threatening letters. John Carlos' wife committed suicide because all the harassment they were getting.
The tragedy for me was when I saw my wife and my kids suffer as a result of what I did. But I wouldn't change anything from what was done that day. My wife would have had to suffer 1,000 deaths, and I'd have had to suffer 2,000 deaths.
Smith and Carlos received thousands of hate mail and death threats.
Tommy and John were never to compete again. Peter never competed again either. We're talking about the best sprinters in the world. Their careers stopped after making a political gesture at an Olympic Games.
Despite the opposition and tragedy surrounding the gesture, its impact on young viewers was profound.
It came out of nowhere in my life, and it made me really think about civil rights. It's just one very visible thing that someone did that moved the whole civil rights movement ahead. But it raised tremendous awareness at a time when there was just tremendous volatility with the civil rights movement.
In 2005, a statue was erected in honor of Tommy Smith and John Carlos at their alma mater.
And we had the shocking ability to grab the attention of the world. The entire world, we caught their attention that particular day, October 16, 1968, by those symbols and by that expression.
Americans have continued to be divided by athletes venturing into the realm of politics. Only 1 year following the silent gesture, Black college football players incorporated black armbands in a game against BYU to protest Mormon doctrines concerning African Americans. By 1995, an NBA player followed the precedent set by Smith and Carlos by refusing to stand during the national anthem, eventually resulting in his suspension from the league. By 2017, over 200 NFL athletes kneeled during the national anthem. They have been faced with opposition from citizens and government leaders. California Congressman Ken Calvert described such gestures to be disrespectful to the inherent value of rights and liberties, as well as to the diverse group of Americans who have defended them as members of our military. The triumphs and tragedies found in modern sports are equivalent to those of 1968. The silent gesture set a precedent for politically charged gestures in sports. This has inspired the younger generation participating in professional and amateur sports to demonstrate in the same fashion.
1968 was something that John Carlos and Tommy Smith did. It opened the eyes of a lot of people, black and white. These guys put their life on the line. They put their reputation on the line to do what they did because they believed in something.
In 1968, amidst the racism and discrimination of the decade, 2 black athletes stepped up to the Olympic podium and made a silent gesture, a triumph that would not be forgotten. When the men lost nearly everything with the tragedy that ensued, they showed the sacrifice that it takes to make a difference. As political protests continue to enter the sports arena, it is proven that with the triumph of representation comes the tragedy of repercussion.